Welcome everyone to In the Company of Stewards tonight. We are grateful to have you here. For those who are unfamiliar with LDS Earth Stewardship, or if this is your first meeting with us, LDS Earth Stewardship is a nonprofit organization that strives to honor the Creator by living and testifying of gospel principles of Earth stewardship. Through educational forums and service opportunities, we hope to help every Latter-day Saint be a steward of the earth. And tonight, we have a fantastic topic and some great speakers with some really solid experience to help us see how earth stewardship can fit in to our service and our awards. We have two presenters tonight. Our main presenter is Kira Smiley. Kira is a dual citizen of the US and Finland, and grew up mostly in the Pacific Northwest, spending plenty of time outdoors, both there and in Finland. After finishing a Bachelor and Master of Science at Stanford University in Earth Systems, she focused on human environmental systems and sustainable global food security in the environment. She started working at X, the Moonshot Factory, formerly known as Google X. She is currently a program manager on a team called Tidal, which has a mission to protect the ocean while feeding humanity sustainably. Kira has been involved in this food space since 2013, but has been interested and involved in environmental stewardship and sustainability since she was a child. In her free time, Kira enjoys creating art, traveling, and getting outdoors to hike, ski, run, or bike. Also joining her for some of the presentation tonight will be Merikay Smith. Merikay is a longtime resident of Maryland and launched the first local LDSES group there in 2016. Besides serving the community as a master gardener who frequently gives talks on sustainable gardening, she also enjoys working with local watershed protections groups, a great way to meet interesting people and have fun while protecting critical habitat. We will now turn the time over to Kira.
Great, thank you, Carly, and excited to get to join Merikay and talk a little bit about our experiences. Well, yeah, just to give a little bit more of a background, my first experience, my mother is very much the person who taught me so much about the environment growing up outside a lot, back and forth between Oregon and Finland. We spent a lot of time outdoors. And my mother was the queen of recycling when I was younger. So she taught me how to go dig through trash and pull things out to sort properly. And that stuck with me, though I've learned a lot since then as well about the waste supply chain, et cetera. But it definitely instilled values. And we talked about the environment and nature quite a bit growing up. And my first project that I had, or first venture into tying that in with the gospel and with church callings, was when I was doing a young women's project. And that was essentially, we tried to set up a recycling system in our church. And so we went and got different recycling bins and set them all up and talked to our bishop and got the go ahead. And then it turns out that behavior change is really hard, as many of you probably have discovered or found over the years. And it turns out that just setting up bins doesn't really work if you don't have a lot of action behind it. And so it ended up being a case where we would play whack-a-mole, where people would put things into the wrong bins or not use the signage and things that we had properly. And so it was really challenging to keep that going. And this is something that I learned when I was 11. And so lesson, behavior change is hard. Then fast forward 10 years or so to when I was at Stanford. And let's see. And I found that as I was in my ward, I was seeing quite a bit of waste, and I was starting to study food waste in university. I was studying about sustainability and sustainable change and human environmental systems and sustainable behavior change more specifically. And so I really wanted to see what I could do to help make some kind of difference in the communities that I was involved in, whether those were my sporting communities or church communities or others. And simultaneously, I was doing quite my favorite topic to study in the scriptures was trying to find any kind of references to the environment, to sustainability, to sustainable food, and just going through and finding any kind of references that I could. And it's funny because now, as I've been made aware of LDSES, and there's this whole page of resources, it was fun to go back and match and see how many of those I found or how that matches up exactly. But I just wanted to share a little bit about the experience that I had in terms of what the steps were to getting to the calling that I had in my previous ward, the Stanford YSA ward, which was environmental stewardship specialist. So the first one was essentially, I started out by, in my own ward, in different events that we had or potlucks or whatever events there happened to be, intervening and restoring trash and doing all the same things that I had started out with when I was younger. And the difference was that there was a much more infrastructure already in place from the city in terms of composting, recycling, other aspects as well. From that, I took a lot of what I had learned from scripture study and from different talks, such as Elder Nash's talk on Earth Stewardship at a recent symposium, and other talks as well, Sister Eubanks, just different aspects in scriptures that I had learned. And I pulled that all together into a deck that I was asked to present at a Stanford YSA Ward Institute Friday Forum, it was called. So at Stanford, each Friday they have a special forum that they ask speakers to come talk about any kind of either their work or some spiritual matter, their mission, etc. And so I was asked to come talk because I had voiced enough during different Sunday school classes and whatnot and talked about it that they knew this was something on my radar, and people finally probably wondered, what is this girl talking about? Let's just give her a stage so she can be one and done with it. And so I had the chance to speak at this. And I think one of the key aspects was, instead of just talking about sustainability and what I had learned in my studies, I pulled in many of those church works. And especially I talked about what church headquarters were doing in terms of LEED certified buildings and diverting food waste and recycling programs, et cetera. And just how much actually was being done, and how there was kind of a disconnect there between what was happening at a high level and then what was actually acknowledged or known in the wards. And people that I talked to, nobody really knew about the work that was actually happening at the church headquarters level. And so bringing attention to that, it was less of a matter of, hey, this is something we need to do and a pull in that direction, and more so, look, this is something that's already happening, and it's something that is already of value. And we have church websites that talk about this already. We have talks and articles about this. It's just a matter of us catching up, not us pulling. And so reframing in that way, I also included some concrete actions that could be taken from, this is students, so in their dorm rooms, and then for those others that were around, what they could do in their communities. And our bishop and our institute teacher were both there. And so then the next step was, the institute teacher approached me afterwards and said, hey, I thought that was really interesting. I'd be really interested in trying to help make our institute classes where food was served zero waste. And so we went in and were able to get some of the institute funding money for the food and diverted that towards trying to get more compostable and reusable items so that we could serve food in a much more sustainable way and zero waste way. So that was the next step. And so he was on board, and other people started asking more and more questions. And I shared out several of the talks and scriptures I had found to our bishop as well. And so from there, the next step was talking to our bishop. And after a few months of talking and sending articles and sending scriptures and just talking about, hey, this is so exciting, this is happening already, we were able to have a conversation. And then I got called in and asked if I would be an environmental stewardship specialist for the ward. And at about the same time, I was visiting, or a a minister to someone in the ward who was also interested in oceans and sustainability. And so I asked if she could be pulled in as well. She was a new student. And so we both ended up being the 2 environmental stewardship specialists in the ward, and decided that, well, we can pretty much make of this whatever we want. And so let's see what we can do with this. And then once that was formalized, the next step was, well, now what do we do? And so we split up what we did into 3 different categories. The first was events, the second was education, and the third was service. So in terms of events, obviously, we have a very community-centered religion, and there are a lot of events that happen, and a lot of them have food, and a lot of them have waste and other things as well. And so our first step is, how do we make ourselves zero waste, and we live in a way that is sustainable and live in a way that is in line with the principles in Doctrine and Covenants, for example, that talk about not taking more than you need and not wasting. And so we did what I had done when I was 11, first off, which is install the recycling bins and composting. But then we took some extra steps, which essentially included putting some more signage throughout the building with guides on what you can and shouldn't do. And then at every single event, one of us, we would tag team. We would stand up on a chair in the middle of the room or cultural hall and say, okay, these are the utensils and things that are available. This is what you can do with them. This is what you can do with your food scraps. These are where they go. And then towards the end of the event, we would assign people to help people sort. And after we did this enough times, it started sticking. So we were able to get much more of the waste diverted and divert almost all of what we had away from landfill, at least, to some other aspects as well. My ideal, of course, would be to have plates that you could just wash, and you'd probably have to do some kind of analysis of the footprint of installing a washing machine and whatnot versus just having compostables, and that's a whole thing. But our first step was, how can we at least divert things from landfill? And then the second aspect was education. And so similar to what I had done with the Institute Friday Forum presentation, worked on doing some family home evenings with people in the ward and environment plus spiritually focused firesides, and included trivia and included talks and whatnot. And so people got more familiar with it, which is in line with the prophet Joseph Smith's words, where you teach correct principles and people govern themselves accordingly. And we found that it was really critical to be able to talk about the why behind what we were doing and to show that it's something that was very much in line with our principles. And from there, people started getting more and more interest because suddenly it's something that applied to them and mattered to them. It wasn't a separate issue. And so I got very many, for example, Facebook messages with random, sometimes very random questions, sustainability related or earth related or food related, and was able to do some individual Q&A and advising, and then would post environmental talks most weeks on our church's, our ward's activity page or Facebook page. And then we also created a sustainable purchasing guide for ward potlucks, events, and whatnot that could be used because we knew that we wouldn't always be there and that we would go away. And so having something that could exist, like a ward handbook, for example, that could live on was something that we wanted to create. So that was the education component. And then finally, we had our service component, which was how do we engage in the community and how do we start getting more involved in Earth stewardship in the Bay Area of California. And so there was quite a few nonprofits that were nearby, and we were able to link up with an environmental nonprofit that we went and worked with, and we're in a nearby neighborhood to our building as an apology for always parking in front of people's houses. And we're able to do quite a bit of planting and native shrubbery projects that we had there. And so that was one project that we had. And from there, we took a photo and the community put it on their Facebook page or their newsletter. And so it also helped build ties with the community and show that it was something that we were interested in. And so then after that, although I moved on and have been in different places, I still get questions often from people who organize events saying, hey, I know that you did something environmentally related or something outdoors, which during COVID, for example, being outdoors is much preferred. And so it's something that actually is fairly feasible to go do some kind of cleanup activity or planting activity or local ecosystem services activity with local nonprofits and continue to tie into the community. So those were basically what was included, the events that were included in this calling that came into existence. And so some of the lessons that I learned from this was, one, if you say something and you think you've said it enough, you probably need to say it 2 to 3 times more. We always think that something is abundantly clear, and very often it's not. And so making sure that you say it more often than you think helps with the messaging and helps with incorporating and really hitting the message home. The second was that you need to check your signage often. If you're setting up this infrastructure, things get moved around. So just making sure that you, but also other people, start feeling committed to it and talking about its importance, so that other people, you can ask them directly, hey, could you make sure this sign is up next to the recycling bin or whatnot, or compost bin, so that people start feeling ownership, and we'll continue that as well. The next one is get ready to answer random questions. And I'm sure many of you have done something like this, as you are the specialist in your wards and your communities as well. And then you have to make it easy. And so what we did is, by one, trying to make sure that when events happened, instead of trying to have people sort through and figure out, is this compostable, is this not, is this recyclable, this is plastic, trying to encourage people to bring things in the first place that were more zero waste or didn't have as much packaging, et cetera. And then the gospel principle being the catalyst for action. So making sure that those resources already exist, like exist on the LDSCS page with resources, making sure those are spelled out so people understand the why. So those are the main lessons I learned, and would love to turn the time over actually first to Mary Kay, if you wanted to share your experiences, and then I can jump into some of the takeaways I got from Sister Eubank's talk and how those related.
Okay, that's great. Everything you said, I 100% agree with, and we had similar experiences. For example, when it came to trying to get people to recycle at events. And I'll have to say, we set this up and we were able to do some work, and then a combination of, we were out of our building for nearly a year and then COVID. So we're basically at a point now of needing to do a reset and start over. But for the little bit of time we were able to be active and where the ward was holding events, what I tried was to do the recycling. We brought recycling bins, and what we learned is it required having someone stay present right at the spot, and we did it in teams, tag teams, because even if even though we do have community recycling, it's surprising. And even though we had signs that would say, trash here, and the composting here, and even examples, this is compostable and this is not, people just didn't pay much attention. So I think there is this learning curve, as you say, that it takes repetition. And I felt that by having our team standing there and just in a pleasant way, not a scolding way, but pleasantly coaching people, gradually people were catching on, and we may have to start over again and do that. But I think after a few events, people will start to be trained, but it doesn't come easily to some people. But stepping back a little bit from this, I wanted to talk a bit about how I got my calling, because my experience is I've actually not seen this in other wards. And so what happened is I was invited, as Carly mentioned, I lead our local, or also very active in the community in environmental issues. So I had been invited to a synagogue for a special service that had to do with honoring trees. And it was wonderful. After the Sabbath service, they had a zero waste, equivalent to a ward luncheon, and it was completely zero waste. There was absolutely nothing at the end. All the food was used, or composted or given away, and or things were put in recycling. There was not a thing. Even the bags they used for the composting and recycling were compostable or recyclable. So I was so impressed. And they asked me, their synagogue is not far from our church building. And they said, could your green team do some service with our green team? And I said, oh, we would just love to do that, except we don't actually have a green team. But I'm probably the closest thing there is to a green team around here for Latter-day Saints, and I'll try to make this happen. So I contacted my bishop and said, you know, we have had an opportunity to do this interfaith outreach with another faith, our Jewish neighbors. They'd like to do some environmental work together with our green team, but we don't have a green team. I'm willing to be to launch a green team if you'd be comfortable with that. And interestingly, I had a friend at the time. I have a friend who was serving as a bishop in another stake and had mentioned this to him. He was like, oh, I don't know that you should ask your bishop. I don't know why. He just thought it was maybe not a great idea. But immediately my bishop responded so positively. He said, yes, that's a great idea. And he turned around and sent it out to the ward council with an announcement. We have a new green team. Merikay's leading it. And he's been very supportive. And so we had an announcement in sacrament meetings saying, is anybody interested? Meet in the primary room or whatever after church. And we had about 16 people join our little green team. And we met and made a list of potential things we wanted to do. And they were very similar. They could be, we didn't think in the same categories as Kira, but we had to support ward events, but to make them more earth sustainable, and to have service events and education. And what I thought was important was not only to engage, these people on the team to get their ideas and make this list from which we could move, but also then I sent it to the bishop to share with the ward council and said, is there anything on this list you'd prefer us not to focus on? And is there anything you'd like to bump up? So that the bishop is able to be comfortable about what might be planned for the ward. And he approved everything on the list, had no problems with anything that we wanted to do. So a couple of takeaways from this, I would say, is if you do not have a green team or someone called to do earth stewardship in your ward, you can just ask. It doesn't hurt. I mean, the worst thing that could happen, I suppose, is they just say, no, we don't want that. Which would be a little bit discouraging, but it's very possible that your bishop, especially if you're willing to say, and I'll do it, and you're happy to do it, and you don't create additional burdens for the ward or the ward council, then I think that you're very likely to find support from your ward leaders to do this. And so I don't know if you want me to share more specifics or if that's as much as you'd like, Kira.
Up to you. Yeah. If there's anything else specifically, I'd be interested to hear, for example, you mentioned the service. So what you ended up doing with the green team,
okay,
for example.
All right, good. So I'll tell you about that. And then I will just briefly share the list of things we plan to do, because maybe it would be of interest to people. So the Shari Torah Synagogue, because of this combination of COVID and for a significant period of time, we were meeting in another community because our building was shut down. We only now are finally getting to do the project on Memorial Day. And it's hard because you have to find a day. It can't be the Sabbath of Saturday, can't be our Sabbath of Sunday, and it can't be a weekday because people are at work. All right, so that was a challenge, but we're doing a project on Memorial Day, which is perfect. So this coming Memorial Day in the morning, they will join us at Pleasant View, which is a historic African-American site where our Earth Stewardship East group has created a very large garden of native plants. And so we'll be going in and doing weeding and mulching. And they've asked me to do a little presentation at the beginning about the history of the site and the benefits of native plants versus lawn. So it should be a really good event. I'm looking forward to it. And we have Earth Stewardship East has a Facebook page and also a website. I'll post after the event some pictures and an explanation of how things went if you want. Our website is eartheast.org. So that's easy to find. And we're just LDS Earth Stewardship East on Facebook. And let's see, for sharing the screen. Okay, this isn't fancy like Kira's, but this was the document that we put together and gave to the bishop. And I just took out the names of the team members for their privacy's sake, since I was just going to share it here. So like you've done, Kira, we tried to tie back to church teachings. So I wanted to have this quote from President Nelson at the top of the document, where he reminds us that we have this responsibility to be wise stewards over the earth and preserve it for future generations. And then we talked about our goal, which was to grow in understanding why and how God wants us to care for creation. And different people on this team had different things that they really cared about, like trying to get the recycling set up and teaching people about what in our local area, how you can recycle, what's recyclable, what's not, to try to build unity within the ward and have fun together while we're doing our various projects. And to support the ward's social activities early on in the planning stage, to work closely with the person who would be planning each of these events, so that we could help coach them in terms of like ways to make less waste, and to offer our services. For example, if we could use the kitchen, we do have plates and silverware and things like that. So rather than using plasticware, to be able to use what was there, and then we'll wash it up, right? So I think one of the key is, don't make it more work for somebody else. Say, we'll take on any of the extra work to make it more sustainable. And we wanted to do reaching out to other faiths to do service, which the first one will be the Shari Torah event, but we'll do other things in the future, I'm pretty certain. And we talked about trying to add native plants to the church property, and maybe work with the temple to try to see if we can improve. Unfortunately, they have pulled out native plants and put in less beneficial plants there. The people in Salt Lake sometimes do things, that are not as helpful as they might be. But for example, just last night with a small group of 8 of us, we have a little native plant area we've planted at the back of the Stake Center parking lot. And so we were there putting in a couple more redbud trees and removing invasive plants. And it was a lot of fun, a good small event that we want to support our ward young men, young women, primary relief society, priesthood leadership in planning events, so that it's on their radar that we can help them plan service or outdoor events like hikes or even a ward camping trip if they wanted to do it. And especially to engage the youth, perhaps in service with interfaith, because that helps on so many different levels. It's not only doing Earth Stewardship, but we're doing interfaith outreach, which the church really wants us to be doing. And the church also really wants us to engage the youth more. And caring about the earth is something that just comes naturally to many of the youth, and they're concerned about the future. So this is a good fit. We've got somebody on our team that is very knowledgeable about like AC and heating, and he was going to do an assessment of the church and also check to make sure we're using the most efficient lighting, to see if we couldn't set up carpools when we do events that require long distance traveling that are associated with the church. And we actually did do this. Mara, who was part of the team, she set up a trash cleanup in a local, along the Muddy Branch, which is a local creek nearby. We want to encourage sharing resources among ward members, that would reduce waste. One of our team members wants to share information on local shopping, especially for food, like CSAs in the area and so on. And we have a lot of people who have large properties, as well as people who are in townhouses condominiums or without places where they could do vegetable gardening. So we thought maybe we could pair people together so that someone like me, I've got a lot of space, big vegetable gardens. In fact, like just as an example, we've already given away 12 bags of kale and spinach just in the last week. And I have 16 and a half pounds of kale that have just been picked today, waiting to be distributed. You know, once you get a garden going, you have way more than you can eat. So this idea of having maybe developing teams where we can nurture people, share the food, and build friendships as we garden together. Someone asked me if we couldn't see if we currently have plastic cups for the sacrament. And so we're going to see if we can't get at least our ward. And that may involve going, you know, like working with the stake or whoever it is who's in charge of the purchasing to see if we can't get paper rather than plastic. Share family home evening lessons, the resources that we've got at Lds Earth Stewardship website in different ways with the ward. And especially in terms of reaching out to the youth, asking the bishop for a chance to speak on topics related to earth stewardship, and have presentations on things like home gardening, stormwater management, native plants, the teachings of the scriptures of the prophets related to stewardship, and so on, in different forums. Like we have an adult family home evening group, so that would be a good place. We have the adult fifth Sunday lessons, that'd be another potential place. Ward firesides, and optional Relief Society events. So that was the list that we made up. We haven't made as much progress on it as I had hoped, but we're at a point now where we can jump back in and get the team active again as we start. We haven't actually, many of us are still watching on Zoom our church services, and we have had no events at all for more than a year. But as we start to get more normalized, we'll be able to pick things up, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of turnout we get on Memorial Day with this joint event, because it will be one of the first things anybody's done together where you're physically together with other ward members.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
So, I mean, as you can see, there is a lot that can be done, and it just starts with asking, which is exciting. And of course, I think Soren mentioned in the comments, sometimes you do get pushback, but I think that, I mean, I got pushback as well in the beginning, and it's just a matter of continuing to build the roots and build, I guess, the grassroots movement in your ward to a certain extent, where you get more and more support, and show that it's something that really is supported by gospel principles, as opposed to something that you're trying to pull in from maybe something outside and totally unrelated. And to that point, I know that Sister Eubank, so I had the opportunity to speak with Sister Eubank when we were at the Fall Forum in 2020, I think it was in November. And I thought that some of these quotes really stuck out to me and brought back to mind the real why behind we are trying to push for these kinds of changes. So one of the quotes that she said that I loved was, "When we waste what others desperately need, what are the ramifications to our physical hearts and our unity?" And I think that to a certain extent, there's small decisions you can make, such as, you know, native shrubbery, or do you compost, or small things, and being able to reframe it sometimes to to essentially love thy neighbor as thyself, which is, there's resources, there are decisions that you make, and can you reframe that to be something where we have resources on our earth and we have what we can and can't use. And so being smart about it and being mindful of others and being selfless and putting others before yourself as Christ would is something that does relate to really principles of earth stewardship and also principles of just being a good neighbor to others. The other one that Sister Eubank mentioned was, she had started with the question, how do we reframe this discussion so we don't have these unsuccessful conversations, to how can our hearts swell as wide as the Trinity, so we stop having those unproductive conversations. And to that, again, love the neighbor as thyself, I think really honing in and pulling in that love to anything from food security to sustainable practices, to just food waste and other aspects in general, there are so many implications that have rippling effects across communities, and especially disenfranchised and communities that live in spaces that don't necessarily have the similar green spaces that wealthier or more advantaged communities do have. And so really tying that back to love and to what we and our individual choices can have large impact is really important. And I think that the gospel teaches a lot about how our individual choices really are important and we have agency. And so using that wisely is really critical. Then the other aspect is when we look, Sister Eubank's message was when we look at our own creations and see what we're a part of, how do we feel? And I think that taking this quote and thinking about how my experience as a child growing up between the US and Finland and Oregon and being in the outdoors and then feeling really close to nature. I think most people feel that when they go outside, when they go on a hike. And so it's a matter of taking that and making that connection over to how you are actually have a role in the system and shifting from traditional thinking where there's silos to thinking about how in a system, everything has an impact on something else. So something as small as the type of transportation you use causes different impacts to the environment, which has impacts across the world and can cause weather changes, or something like the food that you eat and the footprint that has. And so really thinking about how you are a part of a global family, which we know we are, and also thinking about what that means for your brothers and sisters across the planet is another way to help reframe this from something that might not come across as necessarily being completely connected. But when you reframe it in that way, you can see that there's a bit more of a connection potentially. So there's probably lots of different ways to frame it, but these are some of the ways that I've thought about it and that have seemed to hit home or to hit different groups and communities in a different way that maybe they hadn't thought about it in that way previously. And let's see, I think we're pretty much at time, but I wanted to go through a few fast facts before we move into the Q&A, which many of you might be familiar with or might not, but just to bring more emphasis to how this is really part of a big system and how, although like one person, it doesn't seem like you might have that much impact even over time, many people doing the same thing really have a huge impact. And so if we think about food waste, for example, this is something where 40% of food is wasted in the US, and 1 in 8 people, however, in the US are food insecure, and that's 1 in 4 globally. And so there's this, you can see that these things are in silos and there's this disproportionate amount of waste while there's also a lack. And that relates back to Sister Eubank's talk as well, where she talked about wasting what others desperately need. The other is that when we have food waste, that produces methane, which I think many have heard the fact thrown around that it's about 25 times stronger than carbon dioxide. But if you look at it on a smaller 20-year scale, it can be up to 86 times stronger, which then is diluted over a 100-year time scale, for example. But that, and then of course, the meat industry has a lot of impacts as well in terms of energy, water use, methane, et cetera. And so food is a huge place that interacts with people every single day. And actually decisions you have can have wide-reaching impacts. The next one is something that we are focusing on as well, which is plastic. And so reducing packaging in your ward events, but 40% is the amount of single-use plastic that breaks down. And so you know that many of these are used sacrament cups, for example, like Merikay mentioned, you use it for a few seconds and then they're often thrown away right away or just disposed of. And so it's pretty shocking to me to think that half of all plastics manufactured ever have been in the past 15 years, and that's expected to double by 2050. And plastic is such an integrated part of our lives now. We can't really imagine life without it. But thinking about how to reframe and how to shift away from that disposable mindset to something where we want to build longer lasting, use things that are more longer lasting and not waste resources. So using something and throwing it away, in my opinion, is waste. And so thinking about that as well. I spoke about this briefly when I was speaking at the Fall Forum, but I spent some time out off the coast of Bermuda in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and found microplastics in the very center of the ocean there. And about a dump truck a minute enters the ocean. And so if you picture that, there's enough plastic along the coast to line 5 garbage bags full across all coastal areas across the planet. And so there's a lot of change that needs to happen. Of course, it has to happen from lots of levels, not just, it's not going to be enough to be on a individual basis, but once you start with individuals and once you can build the community aspect, then it's something that people listen to, and you can have a lot of influence in other ways as well. So just wanted to make sure that that was on people's radars, that these things that we do in the word communities, while it seems small, has impacts that stretch across the planet. And we might not be the ones that feel those impacts so much, but others do. And so it's important. And I think that there's a really strong message of love and of being a good neighbor that can play into this. And why I really encourage everyone to reach out and try to help build some kind of sustainability green team or stewardship specialist or anything to help wards get more involved with something that is in the gospel and there's a lot of basis for. And it's just a matter of us catching up to that as well. And that is all I have. So thank you so much for letting me speak. And Merikay as well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And I guess I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ as well. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Kira, for sharing your experiences. And I really appreciated that part at the end, kind of connecting, what are we doing in our wards and how does that connect to the bigger picture that as we strive to help our wards shift towards following these gospel principles of earth stewardship, that we are really making a difference in the larger world and taking care of our brothers and sisters across the globe. So thank you so much, and Merikay, wonderful to have you with us tonight. We appreciate you being here.